Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. I've got another episode of utterly pointless comparisons for you today. This time I'll be looking at the Model 2 arcade and Saturn versions of Tecmo's Dead or Alive. As usual, here's a look at the hardware specs for each system while I tell you just a smidge about the game. Dead or Alive came out in the arcades in 1996 and runs on Sega's mighty Model 2 hardware. But wait a minute, didn't I say this game was from Tecmo? If you think Sega didn't have any third-party games on its Model 2 hardware,
well, you're wrong!
DOA plays a lot like Virtua Fighter 2 on speed. It's faster, it looks great, it replaces the block button with a counter button, it adds danger zones around the ring, and it became famous for its ladies', assets. Still, this game was really good. It was different enough from Sega's polygonal fighting games to carve its own path. The graphics were on par with Virtua Fighter 2, so the game looked fantastic, it played great, had great music, and a good cast of characters that even includes Mr. Ninja Gaiden himself, Ryu Hayabusa. A year later, in 1997, Tecmo brought Dead or Alive to the Saturn in Japan, where it sadly stayed. Not to spoil the video or anything, but the quality of this port is fantastic. I'd say it's even a bit better and more arcade accurate than Sega's own excellent VF2 Saturn port. Having said that, it isn't perfect, and there are plenty of differences here to look at and talk about, primarily among those backgrounds. Now, the Saturn version of Dead or Alive also has a bunch of extra options and costumes for the characters, and many of these things are unlocked by beating the game multiple times. An updated version of the original Dead or Alive was released on the PlayStation in 1998, and that one came out worldwide, and because of that is probably the one that audiences around the world know best at this point. Alright, recording methodology for this one. Before anyone gets frothy, yes, these are on emulators. The Saturn version in particular looks a bit fuzzier in this video than it does in real life, because I had to use a gentle de-interlacing filter on it to use it with Saturn. The actual game looks sharper on a regular CRT. Now, I imported the Saturn version when it was brand spanking new, and can tell you it looks great, but it definitely does have that high-res interlaced shake that you may know from VF2 or a few other games on the Saturn. Also, I did some edits to remove the load time and screens from most of the Saturn footage, just to sync it up with the arcade version for the comparison. I'm going to add some raw footage with the loading times and all after the comparison while I'm doing the wrap-up, so you can see how the game actually was, and I also get to look at some of the cool character portrait artwork that's in the Saturn version of the game. Finally, you may notice a few little momentary frame rate dips in both versions here. Neither of those happen on real hardware. That's all just some video capture shenanigans. Alright, let's get on with it. Alright, I skipped the title screen and jumped straight into the character select, which you can see looks quite different in both versions. On the Saturn version, it's a little more Virtua Fighter-y. So here's our first stage, and yeah, you can already tell there's a lot of background stuff in the arcade version that has been changed from polygons to still pictures in the Saturn version. So it's very similar to Virtua Fighter 2 in that way. And as I mentioned just a little bit ago, this one, it looks a little bit clearer in real life on a real Saturn and a real CRT, because it runs in the higher resolution mode of the system, which does have that shaking effect. But for some reason, in Saturn, you know, it doesn't handle interlaced resolutions very well, so I had to put a filter on there to get rid of the awful combing effects that it had. Not knocking Saturn, it's just a quirk that's in it right now that I had to deal with. And that's it for the first fight. Fights are over very fast in this game, as you will continue to see. So in Stage 2 here, you'll see in the arcade version, we've got a lot more polygons. There's a big fancy roof on this temple, and you can see all the gateways and everything are there, all the columns. They have the columns simulated, with just a regular still picture in the background on Saturn, but, they're missing everything else. The roof is gone. They didn't even try to simulate that. Now, on the flip side, there is some of these images look a little bit clearer as images on the Saturn than they do as polygons in the arcade. Not so much this one, but you'll see that in a few of them later on, as we get along here. Now, as far as the characters go, they did an amazing job with them on the Saturn. Even though they're made of way fewer polygons, they really look almost identical to the arcade version. In some cases, I say they might even look very slightly better. That might be because of the much higher resolution that the game runs at on the Saturn versus the Model 2 original. Wikipedia claims this is because the Model 2 doesn't do Gorod shading and the Saturn does, but that is incorrect. But here's another stage where the bridge that we see swaying above us, connected from one mountain to another, that's just gone in the Saturn port, once again because everything is replaced with static pictures for the backgrounds. But other than that, it looks really nice. The one other thing I will call to your attention here is that the colors in the Model 2 version I've brightened up a little bit for this video, because in the Model 2 emulator they are darker than they are on actual hardware. Alright, here we go. Here is John Lee, who is very much like Bruce Lee. He likes to make Bruce Lee noises. And one thing I haven't mentioned too much here yet is sound. And that's because the sound, I mean, it's not very different between the two games. The music is a little bit different between them, but it's very close. The changes to the Saturn version feel more stylistic than anything else. It doesn't feel like they had to be made. I will note that the bass in the arcade version is a little bit deeper in the music, which I found a little strange. But other than that one minor difference, everything sounds great in the Saturn version. Like, some of the instruments are just slightly tweaked, but it still sounds really good, and I don't think anyone will have any complaints. I know I don't. Now, in the Saturn version, you might think it just used the same background twice, but it didn't. You know, we do have differences in the still pictures that are in the backdrop. It is weird that the floor is so much darker on Saturn here, but some things are just a little bit different. We, of course, are missing all the 3D elements, as usual, in the Saturn version. The arcade version has this nice cool thing where you can see faux reflections on the glass building in the background. That's something they couldn't even really try to replicate on the Saturn version, since the building is just a flat 2D picture in the background. Now, I did keep in a few round losses in this recording, so I didn't show only victories this time around, because I actually wanted to extend the gameplay video a little bit, because the game is just over far too fast if I show the victory rounds only. A lot of these fights only take a few seconds. Now, add here, if you're wondering what characters are added to the PlayStation version, well, it's two characters that we see in Dead or Alive 2. We have Bass, and we have Ayane. So they're both in the PlayStation version of Dead or Alive 1. The backgrounds in PlayStation Dead or Alive are vastly different than these ones you're seeing in the arcade and Saturn versions. So here we go with Bayman. And, you know, once again, I don't want to harp on it all. 3D elements are missing, but I feel like in this stage it really doesn't matter too much. And even with the 3D elements missing on Saturn, most of the stages are fine. There were really only a few stages where it has a significant impact, like the temple stage we fought Lei Fang in, the mountain stage we fought Ryu in, and then the last couple of stages. And this game, by the way, it's so much faster than Virtua Fighter. It plays great, and the control method is mostly similar to the Virtua Fighter series, but there are a few exceptions here. The game primarily uses tap-tap Virtua Fighter style moves, but you'll also have a few things that are done with sort of like Street Fighter fireball motions. So Kasumi, for example, here has some throws she executes that way, and also a very low kick that you'll see me do every now and then that actually like knocks them forward. Don't remember which fights I used it in and which I didn't. I definitely did it in the video. You'll see it here and there. The big difference in Dead or Alive between stuff like it and Virtua Fighter is, you know, replacing the block button with the reversal button, the counter button. So what that lets you do is catch any normal attack from your enemy. You just have to get it at the right height, and then you can automatically reverse it. So, for example, they'll go to hit you, you'll press the A button if it's a standing punch, your character will deflect the blow and hit them back in some way. You know, if they do a low kick, you've got to duck and press the counter button to catch that. So there's a little bit of technique to it, but it really speeds up the gameplay and makes things super fast. And when you have two experienced players playing this one two-player, things can get really nuts with the amount of counters that you see flying back and forth, and I just really love what it adds to the game. It gives it sort of another dimension. And I have to say that I really love this game. It's one of my favorite fighting games on the Saturn. Alright, and I guess now we've got to talk about the thing that I've kind of avoided a little bit, and that's the boob bounce in this game. Yes, it's insane. It's not even remotely realistic. It's more funny than anything else because it's so extreme. I guess Tecmo thought they could really reel in that horny teenage boy audience with insanely bouncing boobs. And I don't think it takes anything away from the game. You do have an option, in the Saturn version at least, where you can turn it off. But I don't know if a lot of people realize that that was actually part of the arcade original, so not something they added to spice up the home version. That was there from the beginning. Now, on the Saturn version here, again, just a still background, unfortunately. In the arcade, I like that you get to actually, move on the platform. You see, it's going down the entire metallic ramp there. On the Saturn, all we get are some animations among the lights. It doesn't really look like it's moving. It's just the closest they could do. And the other thing I hadn't mentioned yet that I'm going to squeeze in real fast here are the danger zones. So all around the main section of the ring, you'll see this flashing area. Those are the danger zones. If you knock somebody down on those, a small explosion happens, and they get bounced up high into the air. If you do a killing blow on there, they bounce really high up into the air. And another thing that's a big difference visually between them that I hadn't pointed out yet, and this is my last chance, are the shadows. On the Saturn, shadows are really small and simple. In the arcade version, the shadows are cast and they look, basically to mimic the animation of the characters. We don't really get that on the Saturn. They just got sort of, little dark blobs under them. So that was another big change. But as you can see, the characters look fantastic. The arenas, like the floors and stuff themselves, look really close between the two versions. And the backgrounds are pretty close, even though there's still pictures instead of polygons on the Saturn. So overall, Tecmo really did a bang-up job bringing this home. And it's one of the most kinetic, crazy 3D fighters on the system, even though it might not look like it. And there you go. That's a complete playthrough as Kasumi. So the endings are different in both versions. The music for the endings is completely different in both versions. So the music we're hearing in the arcade version here is not played during the ending in the Saturn, which we'll see in a minute. I love this little name entry thing, initials on the Saturn. After you enter it, you just fall over and die. You get to see the Dead or Alive logo there on the ground. Now, the rest of the ending on the arcade version, it just swirls around and shows you some clips of your character and doing some fights and things like that. While on the Saturn version, we start out by showing some of those still portraits that are used. These portraits are what you see between fights in the Saturn version. After you defeat one character, you'll get a loading screen with a portrait while you wait for the next fight to start. And I'll show you all of that stuff in just a minute here, so you can see what the load times are actually like. And the loading times in Dead or Alive are not bad at all. The fights are not instant like they are in the arcade, don't get me wrong, but they're not even remotely close to the worst loading times I've seen for fighting games on the system. Having said that, you will be sitting there waiting for a few seconds between fights, there's no question about it. Then after we make it through that section of the ending with the portraits, we get another section of the ending where we'll see a lot of pre-recorded footage. These are all video files. They are not real-time like the moves we see in the arcade game. Should be pretty obvious to most, but hey, I'm calling it out just so everybody knows. The other thing I'll point out about this ending here is the music is just so radically different. I would describe it as just a tinge more cinematic. And by cinematic, I don't mean a big booming, orchestral score. There are different types of cinematic music. The arcade version, the ending theme sounds a lot more, I guess I would say, video gamey, which is not a term I like to use, but you know what I mean when I say that, I think. And that's going to do it for the comparison portion of this video. Stick around and I'm going to show you a few things that I couldn't squeeze into this very quick gameplay comparison. Alright, there you are. A complete comparison of the arcade and Saturn versions of Dead or Alive. Here's a glance at the Saturn version with all of its loading time and screens intact. I'll cut to the training mode in a bit, and we'll look at some of the options and stuff. So all in all, Tecmo did a really fantastic job in bringing Dead or Alive to the Saturn. It was never going to look as good as the arcade version, considering the polygon processing differences between the two systems, but they got it pretty damn close. It's a shame we lost some of the three-dimensional backgrounds. There's about 4 stages in this one that I'd say the cuts are pretty significant. And yes, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk again about the boobs. You can see in the arcade original they had the ridiculous bounce, and that is translated to the Saturn version. And if you find that mega bounciness distracting, you can turn the boob bouncing off in the game's menu. This is something that was toned way down in the absolutely amazing sequel. But yeah, in the end, Dead or Alive on Saturn is one of the very best fighting games on the system, and that's saying a lot considering the excellent fighting games that are available on the Saturn. If you missed this one, try it out. Hit up a move list and go for it. Dead or Alive came along at a time on the Saturn when there wasn't a whole lot of big new games for it, especially in the US. I orchestrated getting this one as a Christmas present, since there weren't many new good domestic releases the year that it came out that I didn't already have. Side note, I own more imports for the Saturn than any other system I have because, well, as a Saturn fan back in those days, you kinda had to import if you wanted some of the big new games, since many of them just remained exclusive to Japan. Now, as far as the PlayStation version goes, if you're wondering, it's totally fine. It adds a couple of new characters, new costumes, and changes up pretty much all of the backgrounds. It runs at a slightly lower resolution than the Saturn version, and I don't think the characters look nearly as good. Personally, they almost look a bit cartoonified in comparison. I also don't like most of those new backgrounds either. They kind of take away from the game's personality. But it's still good, I'm not knocking it, and if it's the version you know and prefer, that's fine. It's different enough that I can see why some people might like it better, especially since it adds things that weren't in the original. Anyway, you all tell me, had you seen the arcade version of Dead or Alive before? Had you played the game on Saturn, back when it was new? Did you discover it years after its release? What about the PlayStation version? Did you play that one? Tell me all about your Dead or Alive experiences in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll know when these videos get released. If you like the work that I do here and want to support me, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.